PCI Pharma Services, your world-leading CDMO.
Well, thank you everybody for joining us today for our webinar on unlocking the benefits of custom warehouse for pharmaceutical supply chains. We are very excited to have Gavin Morgan with us today, who is our Associate Director of European Clinical Distribution, who will guide us through the strategic advantages of utilizing a custom warehouse, a powerful tool to streamline supply chains, defer or eliminate back costs, and ensure compliance with evolving trade regulations. We would love to encourage you to actively participate today, looking at this as being a very informal way for you guys to get your questions answered. So we would like to direct you to the Q&A feature on this webinar to be able to submit your questions throughout Gavin's presentation. Alternatively, we will leave 10 to 15 minutes at the end for a live Q&A where you can go ahead and take yourself off mute and ask your questions to Gavin directly, if you feel comfortable to do so. And to ensure a smooth experience, we would kindly ask that you just remain yourself on mute while Gavin is presenting so that everybody could hear the awesome things he's going to be sharing with us. And without that, over to you, Gav.
Excellent. Thank you, Amanda. So hi, everybody. Thank you for taking the time to join. Just a quick agenda for the sort of topics I'm going to cover on today's slide deck. As we mentioned, or Amanda did with the intro around the benefits of a customs warehouse. So prior to that, I'm just going to touch on VAT, import taxes, customs warehouse, how it operates, what it is, benefits to people in the clinical supply chain. I've then got 3 examples of sponsor companies that have utilized the customs warehouse in the last 12 months and the benefits to them. And although we will have time at the end, like Amanda alluded to, for some Q&As, I've also put a few slides together, kind of preempting some of the questions based on, some of the customer discussions I've been having over the last few weeks and months as different sponsor companies have utilized this service offering. So to kick it off, as I mentioned, I just want to do one slide, although those of you that have imported into Europe, or at least, especially the UK, I'm sure you'll be well familiar with this. Regarding VAT, value-added tax, and what is it? I'm not going to spend too much time dwelling on it, but I think it was important to re-clarify what VAT is and the impact that it has, because as this slide says, any import of material that comes into the UK, because this session is primarily focused on the United Kingdom and our UK customs warehouse, they do incur 20% VAT. And a lot of customers ask, it's clinical trial supplies, it's no commercial value, it's not for resale, etc., etc. But unfortunately, the commodity code for pharmaceutical products, even though it is duty-free, it does incur 20% import tax. And basically, the valuation of that material will obviously dictate what that 20% VAT bill looks like. And unless the importer of record, the entity that is bringing the material into the UK has a UK VAT registration, in which could enable them to utilize postponed VAT accounting, if the importer is the owner of the goods, they have to pay, and they're not UK VAT registered, then they have to pay that 20% before it gets released from customs. And the extra caveat on that is regarding VAT recovery. Yes, it is possible. I'm sure we'll have a separate session just to talk around that process alone, but only the owner of the goods is able to reclaim the VAT. So even though companies like ourselves many years ago were able to import, we were able to pay VAT and reclaim it, that is no longer possible in as much as only the owner of the goods can do that now. There is a tax period that runs for when VAT can be reclaimed, and again we will have other opportunities to talk around that, but the main point of this slide was just to re-clarify the fact that VAT payments, especially for high value shipments, can incur, can really impact the clinical budget. So that was just one slide that talked around VAT. Hope that all makes sense before we delve into not necessarily how you can avoid it, but what options there are to not have those financial impacts. So I see there's a few chats, Amanda, with the issues with the slides. Hopefully now everybody can see them. So thanks for those that have confirmed. So I will continue, but any issues, then yeah, please raise your hand or put it in the chat. So we're then going to go on to the customs warehouse, the whole purpose of today's webinar. What is it and what benefits can pharmaceutical companies have? So again, I won't read each slide word for word, but basically the customs warehouse is a company or a facility that has the necessary authorization for them to bring material into that country, get it delivered to that company's facility, process the material in any way that they would have anyway, but without incurring that import VAT that I touched on, without incurring that 20%. So just to keep the math simple, if you had a $100,000 shipment of pharmaceutical product, that would typically incur a $20,000 VAT bill. Bringing it into the customs warehouse doesn't incur that $20,000 VAT. Basically, you're deferring it until you decide what you're going to do with the material. And when I say what you're going to do with the material, I mean, where is that material going to end up? You bring it into the UK, it gets delivered to a facility that offers a customs warehouse. At some point, it is going to leave that company. It's not going to be stored there forever. So how do you remove your material from this customs warehouse process, I guess? And pretty much there's three, to keep it simple, there's three main methods of a customs warehouse removal. The first one, the goods are released for UK distribution. So they're released as what's considered as free circulation. So your $100,000 import, it didn't incur $20,000 VAT. You've had it delivered, you've had it stored, you've had it labeled, QP released, whatever you may be doing with that material. And then you're going to ship it to a UK site. Now, if it is an investigational drug, you do have the ability to release it from the customs warehouse as what's referred to as goods for test, which is a VAT relief process, which is great because there's no UK VAT incurred. If it's a material that doesn't qualify for goods for test, then releasing it for free circulation, at that point, you are going to be accountable for that 20% VAT rating. But again, that 20% is only calculated on the quantity that is shipped. So that $100,000 import, if you were making multiple shipments or small releases, if you like, you would only be paying the VAT on that quantity. And again, that is only if it's non-study drug. You may be re-exporting your material. You brought material into the UK, you've imported it via the customs warehouse process, and then you're going to ship it on to the US, into the EU, Asia, wherever it may be going. But if it's being released for export, there's no UK taxes applicable because it never remained in the UK. There are taxes in the importing country. So if you are shipping it on to a country that also has an import tax rating, that import tax rating in that country, whether it's in Asia, whether it's in the EU, there's still going to be that tax, but at least you've not been hit with the double impact, if you like, of having to pay UK taxes also. And finally, something that we see happen here at PCI is material is imported into our Bridgend facility. It comes into the customs warehouse. Over the duration of that trial, lots of the material is either shipped domestically, released goods for test, or shipped internationally, released for export. And then there's some material that never gets used. We're all familiar with, clinical trial supplies and materials expiring, or studies may not recruit as we would have hoped. And at the end of the trial, there's material remaining in the UK depot. So in that scenario, the material is sent for destruction in the same way as it would currently be. But again, releasing goods from a customs warehouse for destruction ensures that there's never any UK VAT incurred. So, you're getting a feel now for the cash benefits, both from a cash flow or even from a budget. You could be deferring VAT or reducing the amount of VAT payable. Or a best case scenario, you're not paying VAT at all, because like I said, you've either released study drug to the UK, goods for test, or you've released it for re-export. Again, no UK VAT exposure. So as you can imagine, something that becomes very attractive to sponsor companies when they're looking at, do they need to use the UK in the supply chain? What kind of VAT implications are they going to be? Because even though, like I mentioned earlier, when I touched briefly on VAT recovery, sponsor companies as the owner of the goods, they are able to reclaim VAT, whether that's in the EU, whether it's in the UK, whether it's in Australia, Japan. There are countries throughout the world where VAT can be recovered, including the UK. But, it could take 6 to 9 months to get that money back. You could be out, my $100,000 shipment is quite cheap. It could have been a $1 million shipment. in which case it's a $200,000 VAT bill. Yes, you may get that money back in 6 or 9 months' time, but you've got the impact because it has to be paid up front. There'll be admin fees, courier handling fees associated to those VAT payments. So your $200,000 outlay may end up being higher, and what you reclaim isn't quite that full quantity. So, that whole cash flow perspective is something that we are now seeing, again, at least from a PCI perspective, where the customs warehouse is becoming more and more a formality, I guess, especially where the UK is involved. So this slide kind of follows on from that. I've touched on the UK and, how is it still involved, or how can you maintain it within your clinical supply chain? Because we're many years on now in this post-Brexit world, but those of you that have been involved in the distribution throughout that period will be familiar with, with the UK no longer part of the European Union. Why would companies utilize the UK for their packing and labeling if it's then going to go to the EU? Because, you're getting hit with UK taxes and taxes in the relevant EU territory. So, ensuring that you have this VAT exposure considered and you have a process in place to defer, avoid, whichever terminology we want to use, that VAT is key. So this slide is just a kind of a visual aid that I put together just to give a scenario, just to clarify, I guess, what type of shipments can come into the UK and where the customs warehouse could become applicable. And I guess the first answer to my own question is, there's no restriction on what material it is. We're all on this call today involved in the clinical supply chain or with, pharmaceutical products, but it isn't limited to that. We could import ancillary supplies, IT equipment, basically anything that is being imported into the UK that would incur that import tax can be imported via the customs warehouse. So that could be, labeled IMP that's been shipped over from, again, anywhere other than the UK. It could be packaging components. It could be labels that have been printed outside of the UK. It could be the ancillary supplies, syringes, needles, medical devices, whatever it may be. There could be bulk drug substance. It could be API that at this time you could be just looking for a storage solution. There really is no restriction as to what comes in to the customs warehouse. And when all that material is imported, there's no difference with which type of courier gets used. There's no difference with customs clearance timelines or, any of that part. The biggest difference and the most attractive difference, I guess, is you don't pay UK taxes or duty at the time of import. So everything comes into the UK. It's all cleared via the Customs Procedure Code 710. And what that is doing is you're telling the customs agent that, there's no change with the import of record, customs invoices, your valuation methods, etc. The biggest difference is that 20% VAT is being parked until such time you're ready to remove it. And as I mentioned on the earlier slide, when you do remove the material, the three scenarios at the bottom of this image, you've got one as material is being shipped to a UK investigator site, especially if it's IMP or the clinical drug supply, where the goods for test customs procedure code comes into play. So again, no UK VAT at all. It could be redistributed outside of the UK, so re-exported to another depot, bulk shipments to the US, APAC, EU, wherever that material is moving on to. Like I mentioned earlier, there could be VAT or taxes and duties to consider in that importing country, but at least, there was never any UK VAT to worry about. And the option at the bottom, just to put it on there again, just to clarify that whole goods for test process, is if you're importing ancillary materials into the customs warehouse, you're not paying VAT at the time of import. But if you are going to release those ancillary supplies for UK distribution, they don't qualify for goods for test in the same way as study drug does. But in all honesty, guys, the ancillary supplies, they don't tend to be high value. And if they are, you've always got that fallback option that you can reclaim the VAT at a later date from HMRC should you so wish. So that whole, those three scenarios really does give customers the ability of, using the UK. It could be because that's where they've got their CDMO in place or their processes in place. It could be that there's UK distribution or UK trial sites involved. So, bringing material into the UK and utilizing the customer's warehouse helps. Or it could even be, the scenario I touched on with bulk drug substance or API. And there's one of the examples on the next slide when we talk about some case studies is, drug manufacturers, they are what they do what it says on the tin. They manufacture the drug, but they're not storage companies. They don't do long-term storage or storage and distribution. So those of you that have worked with drug manufacturers will be familiar that basically when they've done their part of the supply chain, they want you to collect that material and move it somewhere else. And very often it's getting moved on to the next step of the manufacturing process. But again, if you don't know what that step is, you don't know who's going to manufacture it, you may not even know what country it's going to go to or what clinical trial it's going to go to. So you're just looking at where can I store this material while I make those decisions. Then again, bringing bulk drug substance or API into a customs warehouse does make perfect sense. So I see, just before I move quickly on to the next one, only because there's a quick question that's popped up in the chat regarding a foreign trade zone in the US, or a free trade zone maybe. So in the US, PCI do have, there are imports that come in as an FTZ, but to be honest, at the moment, at least, all joking aside, pharmaceutical product isn't incurring, the taxes that we talk about when material comes into the EU. There's not currently those same kind of taxes when material goes into the US. So unless material is going into the US from somewhere and it's going to be manufactured there, we don't tend to see the same kind of tax relief processes from a US side as we do in the rest of the world. If you're bringing material in for storage repacking in the US, you do have the ability to bring it in and re-export it without incurring any of those duties. But in that instance, there are some different caveats regarding who the importer was, who the courier was, and who's going to do the removal when it's time for export. So the whole US bit does become a little bit more complex, whereas, when we're talking around the customs warehouse, it is purely that material coming into the UK that would typically incur that 20% VAT, but knowing you don't need to worry about, that obviously makes it bringing the UK into the supply chain, I guess. So the case studies that I mentioned, again, there's been a lot more than this, but I kind of tried to find three that kind of touched all the scenarios that I mentioned on the previous slide. And, there may be people, a great attendees list on today's session. There may even be some of the guys on the call today that this may, make a set and think, oh, this sounds familiar, because it may well have been something that we helped you with. But scenario one kind of follows on from my earlier point regarding drug manufacturing sites, when they'll manufacture an API, but then they want you to come and collect it. It could be an ex-work style collection, or they may be ready to export it. They just want you as the sponsor or the pharma company who owns that material to tell them where to ship it to. So we had one scenario where a very high value API was manufactured at a manufacturing site in Switzerland. It is destined to the US, as we believe. That is the longer term strategy, I guess. But at the moment, there's no IND approved for these studies. They don't know what quantity they're going to use in the US, or I think at the time of proposal, it wasn't even certain who they were going to use in the US for onward manufacturing. But what they were able to do was make those shipments from Switzerland to the UK. The shipments, I think there was 2 or 3 shipments in total, over $8.5 million value, as some of these APIs can be. The 20% VAT that would have incurred, or that customer would have been hit with, was over $1.8 million. Like I said earlier, yes, they would have been able to reclaim that VAT, but it would have been a huge impact to them financially, and their cash flow being nearly $2 million out of pocket, and then having that risk of can I get it back? So that material is currently stored at PCI. It's being stored and handled in exactly the same way as any other material, but there's no UK VAT being incurred. And what will happen at a later date, we will make shipments to the US. And when we do that, we will notify the UK authorities that material has left the UK, and therefore that $1.8 million VAT goes away and nobody ever has to be hit with that cost. The second scenario also included Switzerland as it happened, but that was material that was actually bulk IMP that was going to go through a packing and labeling for a global phase 3 study. At the time of onboarding that customer, We were looking at lots of PCI facilities. We were looking at the countries we were shipping to try and get a feel as to which site, when it goes through the site selection process, which site made sense. And this was one where the UK made sense. And the customer was asking, well, why? Why would I bring it to the UK? The reason being, there was over $1.5 million VAT, but bringing it into the UK and utilizing the customs warehouse, again, they didn't have to pay that VAT. The material has been packaged and labelled and released by the QPs. Some of that material has since been shipped to UK investigator sites, so goods for test. That's what we like. Portion of the material has been sent over to our facility in Rockford, so re-exported, no US taxes. And then the remaining material has gone to one of our EU hubs. I think it went to Dublin for this particular customer for EU distribution. So again, that was just a very attractive model to that customer, because had they brought that material to one of our EU sites, because Switzerland is not part of the EU, it would have been hit with the import taxes in those countries, whether it was the 19% in Germany or the 23% in Ireland, but being able to bring it into the customs warehouse saved that particular sponsor quite a lot of money. The final example in these three scenarios, or these three case studies, not as high value, but again, it was a quite simple process where we had the supply chain provided to us at the time of RFP when it was, well, okay, this makes perfect sense. It's a US study eventually. We can't use our US facilities at the moment because, those studies haven't got off the ground yet. They can't import without the IND, etc. So we've had that bulk shipment of drug from China over to here in Great Britain. It was nearly $2.5 million value. So again, $480,000 VAT, no VAT incurred, material just being stored at PCI in the UK until they're ready to ship it over to our US facility, in which case it'll be re-exported. So just three real life case studies, I guess, for you to get a feel when you're looking at your own supply chains as when the UK could become a benefit, or at least the customs warehouse. So the next few slides. Yeah.
Sorry, Gav, just before you start into that, there was a couple of questions. I don't think you could hear me. My earphones decided.
Sorry.
There's a couple of questions in the Q&A. Did you want me to read them to you?
Yeah, no, I've got it here. Sorry, I seen the chat. Okay. I forgot to click on Q&A. No, perfect. So yeah, is using customs warehouse to store bulk API? Absolutely. And the follow-up question on that is, will a QP review of the API be required? It will, depending on where that API is going to go to. So bringing it into the customs warehouse, there's no QP involvement. It can be imported under a standard MIA importer's license. If it is going to be onward shipped, which it obviously would at some point, there may be a level of GMP review if it's being shipped outside of Europe. But if the API is going to be used for a UK or an EU trial, then obviously that opens up the dialogue for QP approval, etc. And then when I know Vicky has mentioned, can we ship to the depot in UK for QP release? Absolutely, you can. I'll touch on it now with some of the Q&As. There's no impact to any potential regulatory aspects, as far as who's doing the QP release, which can, who's being in the CTAs, etc. Nothing changes in your regulatory piece. I know in some countries the importer of record could be linked with, the import license holder and the CRAs, etc. But for the UK, they don't have that same link. You have the logistics and then you have the regulatory. So anything that is would typically go through a QP process remains as is. It's just all of that happens as normal, but without the added complexities of UK VAT. And then, Nick, I know you've answered packaging machinery. Absolutely, it can. Commodities are a little bit different to the norm sometimes, where they could get stuck in customs. This doesn't necessarily get material released from customs quicker. But it does, if you're importing to a company that has a customs warehouse, they typically also have an AEO status, authorized economic operator. There shouldn't really be a problem with getting material released from customs. It helps if machinery has got stuck in customs while any duties or taxes are being dealt with, then absolutely bringing it to a customs warehouse avoids those timelines. But yeah, it does become part, it's not just pharmaceutical products. I guess we would mention. So a lot of these may answer what you've already thought or some of the questions that we've had, but is the restriction on the value? Absolutely not. I've mentioned some of those case studies that varied from $1 million up to having nearly $2 million VAT alone, but it really doesn't matter. The only caveat I would guess I would add to that is if your shipment really is that low value, then maybe it's cost beneficial to pay the VAT rather than pay the service fee for a customs warehouse. Whereas if your shipment is, tens of thousands of dollars, then, again, purely talking from a PCI perspective, the service fee for a customs warehouse vastly outweighs or is much more or less than the VAT exposure or the additional admin fees I touched on. But again, I would look at the value of the shipment before you just default to saying, yep, I'll utilize the customs warehouse. Can the customer, I mentioned VAT recovery, and we see a lot of customers that will act as the importer of record themselves, which they can still do. And some customers, they may be VAT registered, etc. But if you're utilizing a customs warehouse, the owner of the customs warehouse authorization, I guess, has to act as the importer of record. They have to be the company that are providing clearance instructions. So it kind of goes hand in hand. If you're using a company that has got a customs warehouse, expect that they will also be acting as the importer of record. I mentioned it earlier when I talked about the scenario of material being sent for destruction. Is there a time limit? Absolutely not. Material can stay there forever. There is reporting that we have to do to HMRC to confirm that we've got a full control as to what material we've got at PCI and what was imported via this process and what's remaining and where's it been shipped to, etc. But there's certainly no restriction on how long it can remain in that customs warehouse until the removal is required. I've kind of touched on this a few times with the type of activity we do or customers do. There's no restriction at all, whether it's the QP review of batch records and QP release of API, or whether it's relabeling, whether it's secondary packaging, whatever it might be. Everything that you're expecting to happen in your packaging or manufacturing steps happens exactly as is. The only difference, keep going back to it, there's no VAT incurred. I've touched on UK goods for test. So you bring study drug into the UK, or it's packaged in the UK, and it's going to be shipped to UK sites. So you intend to release it as goods for test because that is a VAT relief process. You then realize that your depot in Australia is running low on inventory. So you need some more of that goods for test material re-exported. So can you do that? Absolutely, you can. There is a need for us to go back to HMRC just to ensure compliance, to make sure that they're aware that product X was originally released as goods for test, but now we want to release it for export. Again, no VAT. So, you should always try and define your supply chain up front. But if things change, it's not the end of the world. There's not really going to be any financial impact to that. I mentioned some of the processes that still happen, so there shouldn't be any impact on this. Material still gets delivered, it gets received, it gets QC inspected. To those guys that are doing all those activities, they don't know whether it was imported via a customs warehouse or not, and they don't need to know. It has no impact on the timelines or internal service level agreements. So don't think that importing via a customs warehouse has any impact on your total supply chain or your timelines. Reporting to HMRC, I touched on the earlier slide, would customer X wish to be the IOR? They don't need to be. So therefore, they also don't need to report anything. Because the customs warehouse authorization holder, i.e. PCI, would have acted as the importer of record, it's our responsibility to report all those transactions to the UK authorities as per our agreement. So customer X, other than important, working with your CDMO or working with PCI, you don't need to worry about, or do I need to go back to report to HMRC that my material's now been re-exported, or do I need to provide evidence it was used for UK trials? All of the reporting should be being done by the customs warehouse authorization holder as it is at PCI. And I mentioned on the previous one regarding the value, will every import need to follow the same process? Absolutely not. You could have a very low value shipment that may even be under the VAT threshold, or you could be, your shipment is going to incur VAT, but you've got a process to reclaim it and you're happy with that process. Absolutely, that can continue. And then the next time you have a very high value shipment, you think, I don't want to do this anymore. Can I use the customs warehouse? So absolutely, it's not something that is a one rule for all imports. It can be based on shipment value or customer requirements. But again, we work with customers on a shipment by shipment basis to make sure we import accordingly. And I think that's pretty much it, Amanda. I know I've kind of gone right up to the 30 minutes, so apologies. I haven't really left loads of time for Q&As, but hopefully I've kind of preempted some of those with the last few slides. So Amanda, I don't know if there's anything else I've missed, or if you want to do the the wrap up here?
Yes, there was a couple of questions here. Not sure if you maybe covered them in your frequently asked questions, but we can certainly answer them offline as I
Yep.
want to respect people's time. Let me just go ahead and turn my camera on so you guys can see me. So I just wanted to, first of all, thank you, Gavin, for taking the time out today to speak to us about Customs Warehouse. And I also would love to thank everybody on the line today with us that took the time out of their day to join us. And thank you for your excellent engagement. So I realize we didn't get to all of the questions, but we'll make sure to have Gavin send some answers afterwards. We'll send a follow-up email afterwards to cover some of those questions. And then for the webinar, so we did record today's webinar, and we will be sharing that with all of you in the next few days, along with any additional related content as it becomes available. So please do keep an eye on your inbox for those resources. But in the meantime, we do invite you to explore our expertXchange platform, which is on our website. You can simply scan the QR code that you see there on the screen to be able to access a wealth of scientific insights and knowledge resources that we have available and put out there. And do stay tuned for future invitations to upcoming expertXchange webinars, covering a range of trending topics. And once again, thank you very much for your time and participation. We wish you all a very good day and look forward to connecting with you soon.
The science, the skill, and foresight that drives the delivery of life-changing therapies. We are your world-leading CDMO. This is expertXchange. Together, delivering life-changing therapies. Let's talk future.